The woman walked into a packed federal courtroom in a blood-stained military jacket, and the room went dead silent. Judge Nathan Whitmore stared down from the bench, face reddening by the second. "Ma'am, you will remove that jacket, or I will have you removed from my courtroom." She didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there like she'd been ordered to do worse things in worse places. Then a four-star Navy Admiral appeared in the doorway, spotted the faded call sign stitched across her left shoulder, and stopped breathing. He looked at his aide. His aide looked at him. And the Admiral said 4 words that silenced every officer in the hall. "No one touches her." If this story hits you somewhere deep, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Evelyn Harper hadn't slept in 37 hours. That wasn't a complaint. It was just the math. She'd clocked in at Riverside Memorial Hospital in Ashford, Oregon at 6:14 on Friday morning, and the mass casualty event from the highway pileup on Route 9 had turned what should have been a routine trauma shift into something that looked more like a field hospital in a combat zone. 11 critical patients. 2 of them she'd worked on simultaneously, moving between beds in the trauma bay with the kind of controlled dissociation that takes years to develop and leaves a mark you never fully explain to anyone who wasn't there. She'd walked out of Riverside Memorial at 7:52 Saturday morning, still in her scrubs, her trauma jacket, the old military one she wore over everything when the Oregon cold got into her joints, still buttoned up over the dried brown stains she hadn't had time to notice until she was already in the elevator. She'd meant to change. She'd had a bag in her car, clean clothes, something presentable. She hadn't made it to the bag. The courthouse was 12 minutes from the hospital. She'd been subpoenaed to testify at 9 a.m. She had 14 minutes when she pulled into the parking garage, and she'd used 11 of them sitting in her car with her forehead against the steering wheel, doing the kind of breathing that isn't quite meditation and isn't quite prayer. Just the mechanical act of convincing her body to keep moving when every signal it sent said stop. She didn't change. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself a lot of things on the drive over. The Ashford County Courthouse was a granite and glass building that had been renovated twice in 20 years and still managed to feel like it was judging you the moment you walked in. Evelyn had been here once before, 4 years ago, for a civil matter that had resolved itself quietly and without fanfare. She'd forgotten how loud the acoustics were in the main lobby. Heels on marble, voices bouncing off high ceilings, the low-frequency hum of institutional air conditioning that reminded her, without warning and without mercy, of the field hospital at Basra. She shook it off. She was good at shaking things off. The security line moved fast. She clipped her ID to her lapel, the hospital badge laminated and slightly bent at the corner, and found courtroom 7 on the 2nd floor. The hallway outside was already busy. A cluster of men in suits she didn't recognize, a woman in her 40s crying quietly into a phone, 2 officers standing near the door with the particular stillness of people who were bored and working hard to look like they weren't. She pushed through the courtroom doors and found a seat near the back, behind the gallery rail. Logan Pierce was at the defense table. She almost didn't recognize him from this angle. It had been 2 years since she'd seen him outside of the hospital, and those 2 years hadn't been kind. He was thinner than she remembered. He sat with the rigid, contained posture of a man who had learned to take up as little space as possible, which was almost comically wrong for someone who stood 6'3" and had spent 11 years as a Marine Corps combat controller. His attorney, a young woman named Rachel Voss, who Evelyn had spoken to exactly twice on the phone, was leaning toward him, whispering something that made him nod without looking convinced. The charges against Logan Pierce were aggravated assault with intent to cause serious bodily harm. 3 counts. The alleged victims were 3 men, all in their mid to late 20s. The alleged incident had occurred in a parking garage attached to a shopping center 8 weeks ago. Evelyn knew what had actually happened in that parking garage. She'd treated 2 of the 3 men afterward. She'd also treated the woman they had been in the process of dragging toward a stairwell when Logan Pierce had intervened. She sat with her hands flat on her thighs and watched the courtroom fill. As Judge Nathan Whitmore took the bench at 9:04 with the energy of a man who had already decided what kind of day he was having. He was somewhere in his early 60s, heavy-set, with reading glasses perched at the end of his nose that he kept pushing up with one finger while he reviewed documents. He had the practiced authority of someone who had held this position long enough that deference had stopped feeling like courtesy and started feeling like his natural right. He called the session to order and worked through procedural motions with mechanical efficiency. Evelyn watched Logan's shoulders during this process. They didn't move much. That was either very good or very bad. When it came time to call witnesses, Rachel Voss stood and said, "The defense calls Evelyn Harper, Your Honor." Evelyn stood up, moved through the gate in the gallery rail, and walked toward the witness stand. She was aware, the way you become aware of things when exhaustion strips away your usual filters, that people were looking at her, not the normal courtroom attention paid to a witness being sworn in, something more concentrated than that. She caught a look from one of the prosecuting attorneys, a flicker of something she couldn't immediately identify. And then she was at the stand, and the bailiff was asking her to raise her right hand, and she did. She stated her name, her occupation, her years of service at Riverside Memorial. Then Judge Whitmore looked at her over his reading glasses, and his expression shifted into something she recognized immediately. She'd seen it on the faces of attending physicians who'd walked into her trauma bay and found a nurse running the room. She'd seen it on the faces of contractors in forward operating bases who'd looked at her and seen a woman first, and a combat medic second, right up until the moment they needed someone to keep them alive. "Ms. Harper," the judge said, and his tone had already made a decision about her. "Is there a reason you've chosen to appear before this court dressed in that manner?" She looked at him. "I came directly from a trauma shift, Your Honor. There was a mass casualty event." "I see." He didn't sound like he saw anything. "And you couldn't take 10 minutes to present yourself appropriately." "I didn't have 10 minutes. A beat." Something tightened around his eyes. "That jacket is stained. It's inappropriate for these proceedings." "I understand that." "Then I'm instructing you to remove it." The courtroom wasn't exactly quiet. Rooms like this never went fully quiet. But it shifted. Something in the air changed. Evelyn kept her eyes on the judge and didn't move. "Your Honor," Rachel Voss said, rising quickly, "my witness has just completed a 36-hour shift responding to a mass casualty event and came directly here to testify. I'd ask the court's indulgence, counsel. I did not ask for your intervention." Whitmore pointed his pen at Evelyn. "Remove the jacket, Ms. Harper, or I will hold you in contempt, and this testimony will not proceed." From the defense table, Logan Pierce turned slightly in his chair. His voice was low, barely carrying, but Evelyn heard it clearly because she'd trained herself to hear things that weren't meant to carry. "Don't ruin your life for me," he said. "Just take it off." She looked at him. He had a small scar above his left eyebrow that she'd cleaned and closed herself 18 months ago, after a construction accident that had nothing to do with any of this. He was watching her with an expression she understood. It was the expression of someone who had already accepted a particular kind of loss and was trying to protect someone else from it. She looked back at the judge. Her hands didn't move. The silence stretched. She didn't hear the doors open. She heard the room respond. That specific shift in group attention that happens when something unexpected enters a space, when every unconscious social radar in a room swings toward the same point simultaneously. She turned. He was in the doorway, 4 stars on his shoulder boards, dress whites, which meant he hadn't come from a desk. He was somewhere in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that doesn't come from military school. It comes from decades of carrying weight that would have broken other people and deciding not to let it show. His aide, a lieutenant commander by the insignia, stood half a step behind him. The Admiral looked at the courtroom. Then he looked at Evelyn. More precisely, he looked at the left shoulder of the jacket she was wearing, at the faded black lettering there, at the call sign that had been stenciled on in a base motor pool in Djibouti 11 years ago by a Marine corporal with a stencil kit and a steady hand. His expression didn't change, but something happened behind his eyes that Evelyn recognized, because she'd seen it before on the faces of men who had come back from something they couldn't talk about in polite company. He walked into the courtroom. "Admiral," one of the officers near the door said, taking a step toward him. This is an active proceeding. I'm aware of what it is. He didn't look at the officer. He looked at Judge Whitmore. Your Honor, I need a moment. Whitmore stared at him. The judge was not a man who responded well to interruption, but there was something in the Admiral's presence, not just the rank, not just the uniform, that made the usual machinery of Whitmore's authority stall out for a beat. Admiral, this court is in session. I understand that. He moved toward the gallery, not toward the bench. He stopped at the gate, and he looked at the officer nearest to Evelyn. No one touches her. The words were quiet. They were not a request. The officer looked at the judge. The judge looked at the Admiral. The Admiral stood where he was, with the stillness of someone who had given an order and had no intention of repeating it. Admiral, Whitmore started. Your Honor, I would strongly recommend we take a 5-minute recess. The Admiral's tone was courteous in the way that very serious people are courteous when they're offering you an opportunity to avoid a mistake. There are matters of which this court should be aware before proceeding. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. He was a judge. This was his courtroom. He didn't take orders from military brass or anyone else, but he called the recess. The 5 minutes that followed happened mostly in the hallway, which meant Evelyn witnessed only part of it. She remained at the witness stand while the principals moved, the judge retreating to a side chamber, the Admiral following, Rachel Voss hovering near the door with the controlled anxiety of an attorney watching things move in directions she hadn't anticipated. The prosecuting attorney, a man named Dale Ferris, who'd been watching all of this with the expression of someone trying to calculate odds in real time, stayed at his table and said nothing. Logan turned in his chair and looked at Evelyn. Who is that? He said quietly. Admiral Marcus Drell, she said. Commander, Naval Special Warfare Command. He stared at her. How do you know him? She looked down at her hands on the railing. The knuckles on her right hand were rough in a way that hadn't come from hospital work. I don't, not personally. Which was true in the technical sense. Logan Pierce had served 11 years in the Marine Corps. He understood, better than most, what it meant when a man with 4 stars on his shoulder showed up without warning and said, "No one touches her." He'd had enough experience with classified operations and the way their edges sometimes appeared unexpectedly in civilian life to understand that the call sign on that jacket was a thread that, if you pulled it, would unravel things that weren't written down anywhere. He looked at her for a long moment. Evelyn, it's fine, she said. It's not fine. I'm sitting here accused of assault, and a 4-star admiral just walked into the courtroom and... Logan. She looked at him. Her voice was steady in the way that voices get steady when the steadiness itself is a practice thing, a muscle built through repetition. Let me testify. That's why I'm here. He held her gaze. The burn scars, he said. If you take the jacket off, I know. People will ask questions. Let them. He looked like he wanted to say something else. He'd known Evelyn Harper for 3 years. She'd treated him twice at Riverside Memorial, once for the head laceration, and once for a torn rotator cuff he'd managed to ignore for 6 weeks before it became unavoidable. He'd brought her coffee once during a follow-up, and she'd looked at the cup like she'd forgotten people did that kind of thing. He knew almost nothing about her life before Ashford, Oregon, before Riverside Memorial, before the person she had apparently decided to become. He had suspected, in the abstract way you suspect things about people who carry certain kinds of silence, that the before was significant. He was beginning to understand that he had underestimated exactly how significant. The chamber door opened. The Admiral came out first, followed by the judge. Whitmore's face had undergone a subtle but unmistakable recalibration. The color had returned to something closer to normal. His posture was different, not diminished, but adjusted, the way a man's posture adjusts when he has just received information that changes the shape of a room. He took the bench. We'll resume, he said. He looked at Evelyn. His voice had a different texture now. Not warmer, exactly, but careful. Ms. Harper, you may continue your testimony. The court appreciates your attendance. He paused. The matter of the jacket is withdrawn. From somewhere in the gallery, someone exhaled audibly. Rachel Voss began her direct examination from where she'd been headed before the interruption, which was methodical and right. establish the witness's professional credentials, establish her presence at the relevant events, build the foundation. Evelyn answered the questions with the economy of someone who had learned to communicate essential information quickly and without decoration. Yes, she was a trauma nurse at Riverside Memorial, 14 years in that position. Yes, she had been on duty the night of the incident in the parking garage. Yes, she had treated 2 of the 3 complainants. She used the legal term without being prompted, which made Rachel blink in slight surprise when they were brought to the emergency department. Yes, she had also treated the woman found at the scene. Kezia Drummond, 31 years old. She'd treated her for a fractured wrist, a laceration on her forearm, contusions consistent with restraint, and the specific physiological signs of acute terror that Evelyn had learned to recognize and document with clinical precision because she'd been trained to recognize them in settings where the documentation would matter later. "Can you describe Ms. Drummond's condition when she arrived?" Rachel asked. She was in shock, not just physical, though she had physical injuries. She was nonverbal for approximately 8 minutes after arrival. When she was able to speak, the first thing she said was that the man who pulled them off her had saved her life. Ferris, the prosecutor, was on his feet. "Objection, hearsay. Your Honor, this is a statement made under acute medical distress immediately following the event. It qualifies as a present-sense impression under the exception," Rachel said without hesitation. Whitmore considered. "Overruled. Continue." Evelyn continued. She had treated the 3 complainants in sequence. The first had a dislocated shoulder and a hairline fracture to the radius. The second had 2 broken fingers on his left hand and a deep contusion on his temple. The third had presented with respiratory distress. And here, Evelyn paused, not for effect, but because what came next was important and she wanted it to land clearly. "The third complainant," she said, arrived with partial airway obstruction. He was in respiratory distress. His SpO2 was 84% when the paramedics brought him in, which is critically low. Without intervention in the next few minutes, he would have experienced hypoxic brain injury or death. The courtroom was very quiet. "And were you able to determine what had caused the obstruction?" "Yes. He had sustained a fracture to the hyoid bone, the small U-shaped bone in the throat. It's an unusual injury. In the vast majority of cases, hyoid fractures in adults result from strangulation." She paused again. "However, in this case, the pattern of the injury was inconsistent with that cause." "Can you explain what you mean?" "A strangulation pattern hyoid fracture typically presents with specific surrounding tissue damage, bruising in a characteristic distribution, petechiae, other markers. This patient had none of those. What he had was consistent with a precision anterior neck maneuver, specifically a controlled strike designed to partially collapse the airway without causing additional systemic trauma." She looked at the jury without being asked to. "It's a technique, a very specific, very trained technique. It's the kind of thing you use when you need to incapacitate someone quickly and you're trying not to kill them." Ferris was on his feet again. "Objection. The witness is speculating about the defendant's intent. I'm describing the medical evidence," Evelyn said calmly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "The intent is a matter for this court. The physical evidence is mine to address." Whitmore looked at her. Something had shifted in his expression over the course of the last 20 minutes. The early irritability had been replaced by something she'd seen before, on the faces of people who were recalibrating what they thought they were looking at. "Overruled," he said. "Continue." "The third complainant also required an emergency surgical airway procedure, not in the field, in my trauma bay. He required a cricothyrotomy, which I performed. He survived. He recovered without neurological deficit." She folded her hands on the railing in front of her. "If Logan Pierce had struck that man with the intent to cause serious harm, he would have used more force and a different technique. What he used was the minimum necessary to stop him from doing what he was doing." The silence in the room was the kind that happens when a room full of people is trying to hold still while the ground shifts under them. What? Ferris's cross-examination was aggressive, in the way that cross-examinations get aggressive when the examiner knows the witness has just damaged his case and he's trying to find the crack in the foundation before the jury settles on what they've heard. He tried the credentials angle first. "Ms. Harper, you're a nurse, correct? Not a physician?" That's correct. So you're not qualified to make diagnostic determinations. I'm a level 1 trauma nurse with 14 years in a major trauma center. I'm certified in advanced trauma life support and emergency nursing. I have performed or assisted in over 2,000 trauma cases. I've performed emergency surgical airways in the field. She kept her voice even. I'm qualified to describe what I observed and what the evidence indicates. In the field, Ferris repeated, picking up the phrase like a thread. You've mentioned field work. Can you explain what that means? Evelyn looked at him. Prior to my work at Riverside Memorial, I served as a combat medic. Where? Multiple deployments, Iraq, Afghanistan, Horn of Africa. And what rank did you hold? She paused. Not a long pause. Half a second, maybe, but it was there. I left the service as a sergeant first class. In what unit? This time the pause was longer. She looked at the Admiral, who was seated in the gallery now in the second row, watching her with the particular stillness of a man at a ceremony where the honoree doesn't know she's being honored. That information is classified, she said. The courtroom stirred. Ferris blinked. He hadn't expected that answer. You could see the recalculation happening in real time. It's classified, he repeated. Yes. Ms. Harper, you're under oath, and classified information remains classified under oath, Mr. Ferris. You're welcome to pursue the matter through the appropriate channels. She said it without edge. Pure information. Ferris shifted tactics. He moved to the medical evidence, challenged the cricothyrotomy documentation, tried to suggest the airway injury predated Logan's intervention. Evelyn dismantled each challenge with the patience of someone who had been doing this, not courtrooms specifically, but the work of making the truth visible in chaotic situations for most of her adult life. She referenced specific chart entries, timestamps, the paramedic field report, the photograph taken by the ER charge nurse upon the complainant's arrival. She had the documentation. She had brought it with her, organized in a manila folder she'd grabbed from her car because she'd known this would happen. Ferris moved to strike portions of her testimony 3 times. Whitmore denied all 3 motions. And then Ferris made a mistake. He turned to face the jury and said, with the particular confidence of an attorney who thinks he has a card left to play, Ms. Harper, isn't it true that the initial police investigation found no weapon on or near any of the 3 complainants? No knife? No firearm? Nothing. Evelyn looked at him. In the gallery, she saw Logan's attorney's pen stop moving. That's what the initial report states, Evelyn said. Yes. So your claim that these 3 men were armed is unsupported by the physical evidence. The initial report states no weapon was recovered, she said carefully. That's accurate. Ferris nodded, turning back toward the jury with the body language of a man closing a door. However, Evelyn said, he stopped. The courtroom stopped. She reached into the manila folder. She removed a document, a single printed page with a photograph attached, and she held it where the judge, the jury, and the attorneys could see it. The initial report states no weapon was recovered. What it doesn't explain is why the emergency room photograph taken 40 minutes prior to the initial evidence collection shows a folding knife with a 4-inch blade clipped to the interior waistband of complainant 2, visible in the frame because his shirt had ridden up during transport. She set the document on the railing in front of her. That knife is not mentioned anywhere in the police report. It's not in the evidence log. It's not in the property inventory taken at the scene. She looked at Ferris with an expression that wasn't satisfaction. It was something quieter than that. Something closer to the expression of a person who has been waiting a long time to say a true thing out loud. I took that photograph myself. I take photographs of significant patient presentation details during trauma admission. It's part of my documentation protocol, and it's been part of my protocol for 14 years. The courtroom didn't erupt. It did something stranger than that. It went very, very still, the way rooms go still when everyone in them simultaneously understands that something has just changed in a way that can't be changed back. Judge Whitmore was staring at the photograph she'd set on the railing. Dale Ferris was not moving. Logan Pierce had both hands flat on the defense table, and he was looking at Evelyn Harper. Not with gratitude exactly, because the moment was too large for something as simple as gratitude, but with the expression of a man who has been standing in the dark for a long time and has just seen the first light come through. The Admiral in the second row had been still for several minutes. He was still now, but something had shifted in the set of his shoulders, the same quality of stillness, but with a different weight beneath it. Evelyn set her hands flat on the manila folder. She had 3 more documents inside it. She had the timestamp records from the hospital's security system. She had the paramedic handoff notes. She had a second photograph taken from a slightly different angle that caught the same knife and also, if you knew what you were looking at, showed the mark on Keisha Drummond's forearm that was consistent with a blade edge rather than a blunt object. She was not done. But right now, in this particular breath between one thing and the next, Evelyn Harper sat in the witness stand of a courtroom in Ashford, Oregon, in a blood-stained jacket with a classified call sign on the shoulder, and watched the case against Logan Pierce begin to come apart at its seams. Not because she was extraordinary, not because she was a hero, but because she had been paying attention when it mattered, 14 months ago, in a trauma bay at 2 a.m., and she had written it down. Judge Whitmore looked at the prosecuting attorney. His voice, when he found it, had the particular quality of a man who has just realized the ground beneath the chair he's been sitting in has been hollow the entire time. "Mr. Ferris," he said slowly, "can you explain to this court how a weapon documented in a hospital photograph 40 minutes before the initial evidence collection was not included in the police report?" Ferris opened his mouth and said nothing. Ferris closed his mouth, opened it again. The sound that came out was not words. It was the sound of a man whose prepared argument had just met something it had no framework for, and the machinery had stalled. "Your Honor," he said finally, "I need time to... The investigation team would need to be consulted." "Mr. Ferris." Whitmore's voice had gone flat in a way that was more alarming than if he'd raised it. "A weapon appears in documented hospital photography taken 40 minutes before your investigation's evidence collection window. That weapon does not appear anywhere in the subsequent police report. You are the attorney for the prosecution. I'm going to ask you again, can you explain this discrepancy?" Your Honor, I was not aware of this photograph. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room absorbing information. It was the silence of a room doing the math and not liking the answer. Rachel Voss was on her feet before Whitmore finished his sentence. "Your Honor, the defense moves to have this photograph and supporting documentation entered into evidence immediately. We further request a brief recess to file a motion compelling the prosecution to produce its full evidence inventory for defense review." "Granted," Whitmore said. He looked at Ferris. "Both requests granted." Ferris sat down slowly, the way men sit when their legs stop working the way they're supposed to. Evelyn handed the photograph to the bailiff. She watched it travel from the railing to the judge's bench, watched Whitmore study it with his reading glasses pushed up his nose, and she felt the thing she'd been holding since 2 a.m. 14 months ago. The tight, low-frequency frustration of knowing something true and watching the system ignore it begin, very slowly, to ease. Not gone, not done, but beginning. The recess lasted 40 minutes, which was 20 longer than Whitmore had indicated. Evelyn spent it in the witness anteroom off the second-floor hallway, a small beige space with 2 chairs, a water cooler, and a window that looked out over the courthouse parking structure. She drank 2 cups of water from a paper cone, the kind that collapses in your hand if you hold it too long, and she stood at the window and watched the clouds move over the parking garage roof. Rachel Voss came in at the 15-minute mark. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, and she looked at Evelyn with the expression of someone recalibrating everything they'd thought they understood about the case they were managing. "That photograph," Rachel said. "You've had it for 14 months. "Yes." You didn't think to mention it before today?" "I mentioned it to the detective who took my initial statement, twice. He told me the photograph wasn't relevant because the knife hadn't been recovered at the scene and couldn't be confirmed to belong to any of the complainants." Evelyn looked at her. "He wrote in his notes that I was, and I'm quoting, confused about the timeline of events." Rachel stared at her. "He said you were confused." "He said I was confused." You're a trauma nurse with 14 years of experience who documented the photograph with a timestamp within the hospital's own system, and he told you that you were confused about the timeline. He did. Rachel pushed off from the door and walked to the window, stood next to Evelyn, and looked out at the parking structure for a moment. The detective's name is in the original police report, Kendrick Solano. I know his name. This is going to go somewhere very bad for him. I know that too. Rachel looked at her sideways. You've been waiting for today. Evelyn thought about the question more carefully than Rachel probably expected her to. It wasn't that she'd been waiting exactly. She'd gone back to work after the detective dismissed her. She'd kept the photograph in her files because that's what you did with documentation. You kept it because the moment you threw it away was the moment it became the only thing that mattered. She'd gotten the subpoena 6 weeks ago, and she'd looked at the photograph again and thought, okay, now. I've been doing my job, she said. Today, my job is this. When the court reconvened, the energy in the room had changed in a way that was harder to locate than simple tension. It was more like the quality of air before a storm you can't see yet, pressure without specific source, the body registering something before the mind catches up. Whitmore had clearly used part of the recess to make calls. The set of his face said so. He took the bench with the deliberate care of a man who was aware that the next several hours were going to require more precision than the morning had demanded. He looked at Ferris first. Mr. Ferris, has the prosecution had the opportunity to review its evidence inventory? Ferris stood. He had a different attorney beside him now, an older man in a gray suit who hadn't been in the courtroom before the recess. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to make a statement. Then make it. Ferris glanced at the man beside him, a glance that said, help me, and received nothing in return. The prosecution has completed a review of its evidence inventory in light of the documentation presented by the defense witness. We can confirm that the photograph referenced by Ms. Harper does not appear in any materials provided to the prosecution by the investigating officers. The word provided was carrying a lot of weight in that sentence, and everyone in the room who'd been paying attention felt it. Are you representing to this court, Whitmore said very carefully, that the prosecution was not in possession of this photograph prior to today? Yes, Your Honor. Then the question of how that photograph came to be excluded from the materials provided to the prosecution is a matter this court will address. He paused. Continue, Ms. Voss. Rachel resumed her direct examination of Evelyn with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that the momentum had shifted and intended to use it. She walked Evelyn through the second photograph, the one showing the mark on Kezia Drummond's forearm. She walked her through the paramedic handoff notes, which documented that Drummond had been found on the ground with her wrist bent at an angle inconsistent with a fall. She walked her through the timestamp records from the hospital's security system, which placed all 3 complainants in the ER before the police finished their initial evidence sweep. Each document entered the record. Each one fit against the next the way documentation fits when it's real, with the minor imperfections of actual record keeping, the slightly blurry security image, the handwriting in the paramedic notes that switched between 2 different pens because one had run dry. Not clean, not assembled, just true. Ferris attempted cross-examination twice more. The second attempt lasted 4 minutes before he sat down. The gray-suited attorney beside him hadn't said anything yet. He was watching the proceedings with the expression of a man doing a risk calculation and not liking any of the outcomes. Logan Pierce was called to testify after Evelyn, and she sat in the gallery and watched him take the stand. He was a different kind of witness than she was. Not worse, not less credible, but different in the way that people who carry guilt are different from people who carry information. Logan wasn't guilty of anything, but 11 weeks of being accused had done the thing that accusations do. It had worn a groove, and even innocent men start to wonder, after a while, if the groove means something. Rachel walked him through the night. He'd been in the parking garage, level 2, near his truck. He'd heard a woman's voice, not screaming, but wrong. The specific wrongness that you learn to recognize when you've spent years in environments where wrong sounds come at you from multiple directions and the wrong response gets people killed. He'd moved toward it. He'd seen 3 men and a woman. He'd assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds and intervened. Did you intend to cause serious injury to any of the three men? Rachel asked. Logan looked at the jury. No, I intended to stop them from hurting her. I used what I knew. I used the minimum that would work. The third complainant suffered a hyoid fracture. Are you trained in that technique? I'm trained in multiple techniques. That one specifically, yes. It's a controlled incapacitation. You use it when you can't risk someone continuing to fight and you can't risk killing them. He paused. He was reaching into his waistband. I didn't know what he was reaching for. You were afraid. He considered the word. I was precise, he said. Fear is something you manage. What I did was managed. It was, Evelyn thought, the most accurate description of what she'd seen in the injury pattern. The controlled precision of someone who wasn't flailing, wasn't panicking, but was operating under a specific cognitive framework that produced a specific physical response. Ferris's cross-examination of Logan was shorter than his cross-examination of Evelyn. At one point, he asked Logan why he hadn't simply called the police instead of intervening directly, and Logan said quietly, because by the time they arrived, it would have been over. And the jury did the math on what over meant, and no one asked a follow-up. It was during the lunch recess that Evelyn first became aware of the man who was not the Admiral. She'd gone to the vending machine on the first floor. She hadn't eaten since the granola bar she'd shoved in her pocket during the last hour of her shift, which was before the highway pileup had consumed the last 4 hours. So the math on that was grim. She was standing in front of the machine trying to decide whether the sadness of a vending machine sandwich was worth the alternative of nothing when she registered a presence at her left shoulder. Not threatening, just deliberate. She turned. The man was somewhere in his mid-40s, civilian clothes. A good suit, not a lawyer's suit, something with money in the fabric that you noticed without being sure why. He had the specific stillness of someone trained to move through spaces without drawing attention, and he was not quite succeeding at it with her because she'd been trained by the same general framework. Ms. Harper, he said. Not a question. You have the wrong person, she said. I don't. He glanced at the vending machine and then back at her. Victor Harlow would like to speak with you. She looked at him for a moment. Victor Harlow. She knew the name. She'd done her reading before today. No. He's prepared to be generous. I said no. Ms. Harper, I heard you the first time. She turned back to the machine, put in her $1.50, and selected the sandwich. If Mr. Harlow has something to say that's relevant to these proceedings, he can say it in a courtroom. She picked up the sandwich. This conversation is over. She walked away from the machine without looking back, but she filed it. The suit, the face, the specific phrasing of prepared to be generous, and she filed it in the same place she'd filed the detective's dismissal and the judge's early contempt, and the way Ferris had said confused when he was really saying inconvenient. She found Rachel Voss in the hallway and told her about the exchange in 30 seconds. Rachel took out her phone immediately. Evelyn watched her type and thought about what Victor Harlow's willingness to approach a witness during an active recess said about how frightened he was and what that fear meant for what was still to come. The afternoon session opened with something no one in the gallery had expected. Dale Ferris stood before Judge Whitmore and stated, in the careful language of a man who had been on the phone during the lunch recess with people whose voices he was not going to ignore, that the prosecution wished to present additional information regarding the physical evidence collected at the scene. The additional information came in the form of a statement from a second forensic technician, not the lead investigator, but a junior tech named Torres who had been at the scene and had not been listed in the original report. Torres wasn't present in the courtroom. His statement was read into the record by Ferris in the monotone of an attorney reading something he desperately didn't want to be reading. In the statement, Torres described observing a folding knife at the scene. He described watching his supervising officer, Kendrick Solano, pick up the knife, examine it, and place it in his coat pocket rather than an evidence bag. He described being told, afterward, that the knife was not relevant to the case. He described filing no objection because he was 6 weeks out of his training program, and Solano had 12 years on him, and the authority that comes with 12 years and the willingness to use it. Torres had given this statement to an internal affairs investigator 14 days ago. It had not made it to the prosecuting attorney's office. 14 days. The gray-suited attorney beside Ferris was very still. Whitmore set down the document he'd been reading from. He set it down carefully, in the way you set things down when what you want to do is throw them. He looked at the space above the gallery for a moment, then back down at the room. "Mr. Ferris," he said. "A junior forensic technician filed a statement with Internal Affairs 14 days ago describing evidence tampering by a supervising officer on this case. That statement did not reach the prosecution. You're telling me that you were unaware of it?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And the supervising officer in question, Detective Solano, is listed as the lead investigator on the case that is currently before this court?" "Yes, Your Honor." Whitmore looked at the jury. He looked at Rachel Voss, who was sitting with the controlled stillness of a person who is maintaining composure, because composure is what the moment requires, and not because composure is what she feels. He looked at Logan Pierce, who had both hands on the table in front of him and was looking at nothing, processing something too large and too sudden to have a normal expression for. Then he looked at the gallery, and for a half-second his eyes found Evelyn Harper, sitting in the third row in a blood-stained jacket, holding the wrapper from a vending machine sandwich she hadn't quite finished. She met his gaze. She didn't look away, and after a moment, neither did he. "We're going to take a 20-minute recess," Whitmore said. His voice had none of its morning authority in it. What it had instead was something quieter and harder to name. The sound of a man understanding, in real time, the dimensions of what had been happening in the case on his docket. "And when we return, I'm going to be issuing several orders that will significantly change the nature of today's proceedings." The gallery erupted. Not loudly. This wasn't that kind of room, but the sound of 30 people all turning to one another simultaneously had its own particular volume. Evelyn folded the sandwich wrapper into a small square and put it in her jacket pocket. She looked at the Admiral, who was still in the second row, and for the first time since he'd walked into the courtroom, he looked directly back at her. His expression said nothing specific, but he gave her the smallest nod, barely a movement, a half-degree tilt of the head, and she understood it the way she understood a lot of things that didn't come with subtitles. "Good work." She looked away before she had to figure out what to do with that. What? The 20-minute recess lasted 35. When Whitmore returned, he had a printed document in his hand and the expression of a man who had spent 35 minutes on the phone with people above his own authority level and had emerged from it with a clearer picture of how deep the problem went. He called the court to order. He began by entering Torres's statement into the official record. He then issued a formal preservation order covering all physical evidence, documentation, and communications related to the original investigation. A legal instruction meaning nothing could be altered, destroyed, or relocated. He issued a second order compelling the production of Detective Solano's case file in its entirety, including all notes, communications, and evidence logs within 48 hours. And then he said something that hadn't been on anyone's agenda for the day. This court is also issuing a preliminary inquiry referral to the Ashford County District Attorney's Office regarding potential obstruction of justice and evidence tampering in connection with the investigation preceding this trial. He paused, and in the pause you could hear the weight of what he hadn't said yet. This referral will include all relevant parties whose actions may have contributed to the incomplete and potentially manipulated evidence record that this court has been working from. He looked at Ferris. He looked at the gray-suited attorney. "All relevant parties," he said again. The gray-suited attorney put down his pen. His name was Gerald Fitch, and he was the senior partner at a firm that had done significant legal work for Victor Harlow's company over the previous 8 years. He had arrived at the courthouse at 11:42 a.m., during the first recess, after a call from Harlow's personal phone. He had sat beside Ferris for the afternoon session and said nothing, because saying nothing had seemed like the right strategy at 12:30 when the situation still seemed manageable. At 3:47 in the afternoon, as Judge Whitmore issued his third formal order of the session, and the word obstruction sat in the air of the courtroom like something that had landed and wasn't leaving, Gerald Fitch began to understand that saying nothing had been a strategy built on ground that was no longer there. He looked at his phone. He had 3 missed calls from Victor Harlow in the last 40 minutes. He didn't call back. Evelyn left the courthouse at 4:23 p.m. She didn't leave because the proceedings were over. They weren't. The session had been adjourned until the following morning, with the various referral and preservation orders in place, and both sides instructed to appear at 9 a.m. with counsel prepared to address the court's questions about the investigation. She left because she had been awake for 39 hours and her hands were starting to shake, in the small, almost invisible way they shook when her body had stopped accepting reasonable explanations for why it should keep going. The hallway outside Courtroom 7 was busy with the post-session dispersal, attorneys in clusters, a couple of journalists who'd been in the gallery and were now making calls in the corridor, the regular court staff moving through with the practiced efficiency of people whose workday continued regardless of what had happened inside the room. She was at the elevator when she heard her name. She turned. Logan Pierce was coming down the hallway, his attorney beside him and then falling back as he closed the distance between them. He stopped about 3 feet away, and for a moment he didn't say anything, and she understood that he was trying to locate words in a situation that kept exceeding the ones available to him. "The photograph," he said finally. "It was documentation." "Evelyn, you had that for 14 months. You could have—" He stopped, started again. "I know what it cost you to come here today. I know what it costs you just to be in a building with this many people when you've been awake for 40 hours, because I know what that feels like, and I know what you look like right now." She looked at him. He wasn't wrong. "I'm fine." "You're not. But you're standing up, and that's—" He pressed his mouth into a line. He was not a man who cried easily, or probably at all in public, but his jaw was doing the thing jaws do when men work very hard not to. "Thank you. That's all I just needed to say it." She nodded. There wasn't a cleaner response available. "Go home," he said. "Sleep." "I will." She turned back toward the elevator. "Harper." She stopped. "The knife in the photograph," Logan said. "The one Solano pocketed. That knife belonged to the guy I hit in the throat. I saw it before I hit him. That's why I hit him the way I did, because he was going for it." She looked back at him over her shoulder. "I know." "How?" "The angle of his reach, the way he was positioned. It's in the second photograph, the one I haven't entered yet." She pressed the elevator button. "It'll be in the record tomorrow morning." The elevator opened. She stepped in. Logan was still standing in the hallway, looking at her with the expression of a man who has just realized that the person who saved his life had been 3 steps ahead of the entire situation since before he'd even known he needed saving. The doors closed. She made it to her car. She sat in the driver's seat and she pulled out her phone to check the time, 4:31, and she saw a missed call from a number she didn't recognize, with a 703 area code that she recognized immediately, because 703 was Northern Virginia, and Northern Virginia was where certain organizations kept their main switchboards, and she had spent years knowing those numbers the way you know numbers that have been part of your professional life. She stared at the missed call for a moment. Then she put the car in reverse and started for home. She was 3 blocks from the courthouse, stopped at a red light, when her phone rang again. Same number. She didn't answer. She drove. It rang a 3rd time at the intersection of Halcourt and Main, and she pulled over to the shoulder and sat there with the engine running and the phone ringing in her hand, and she looked at the screen for a moment longer than she meant to. She answered. "Harper," she said. There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind of pause that happens on secure lines when the connection takes a half-second longer to establish than a regular call. Then a voice she didn't recognize. Female, crisp, mid-Atlantic accent. "Ms. Harper, this is Deputy Director Aldis, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. I'm calling in reference to today's proceedings in Ashford County Court and certain matters that have come to our attention in connection with the original investigation. We'd like to meet with you at your earliest convenience." Evelyn looked through the windshield at the Ashford skyline. Low buildings, gray cloud cover, the top of the courthouse still visible 2 blocks east. "I have to be back in that courtroom at 9 tomorrow morning," she said. "We're aware. We'd like to meet tonight." Another pause. "Ms. Harper, the investigation into Detective Solano and the parties connected to this case has been ongoing for 11 days. The photograph you presented today confirms a significant element of the timeline we've been developing. We need your original documentation." She closed her eyes for 2 seconds, opened them. "Where?" she said. The address the deputy director gave her was 12 minutes away. Evelyn put the car back in drive, and the streetlight in front of her turned green, and she drove. The address was a Hampton Inn on Collier Street, which was either the least conspicuous location NCIS could have chosen or the most, depending on how you thought about these things. Evelyn pulled into the parking lot at 4:43, sat in the car for a moment looking at the building, then got out. Room 214 was on the second floor. She knocked twice. The door opened immediately, which meant someone had been watching the parking lot, which meant there was at least one person in this operation she hadn't seen yet. Deputy Director Aldous was shorter than her voice suggested. Early 50s, dark hair cut close, the kind of posture that came from years of being the most prepared person in any room she entered. She had a laptop open on the desk, and two other agents in the room, both male, both doing the careful neutrality that field agents did when they were trying not to look like they were assessing you. "Ms. Harper," Aldous gestured to the chair by the desk. "Thank you for coming." "You made it sound optional," Evelyn said. "It wasn't." A brief pause. The corner of Aldous' mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "No, it wasn't." She pulled a chair around to face Evelyn's and sat. 11 days ago, we received an anonymous tip regarding the investigation into the Pierce case. The tip referenced evidence that had been removed from the scene. We began looking at Detective Solano's financial records 4 days later. She paused. "Ms. Harper, in the 6 weeks since Logan Pierce was charged, Detective Solano has received 3 wire transfers totaling $47,000, originating from a shell company incorporated in Delaware. We've traced that shell company to a holding entity connected to Victor Harlow's real estate development group." Evelyn looked at her. $47,000 to bury a knife. To bury a knife and ensure the case proceeded in a specific direction. Aldous leaned forward slightly. "The woman in that parking garage, Kezia Drummond. Do you know who she is?" 31 years old, works in commercial real estate. She was until recently employed by one of Harlow's subsidiary companies. She left that employment 6 weeks before the incident in the parking garage, under circumstances that her former colleagues describe as, and I'm summarizing here, deeply unpleasant. Aldous looked at her steadily. "We believe the 3 men in that parking garage were not acting randomly. The math on that landed quietly and completely, the way things land when you've already suspected the shape of them without having the specific numbers." "He sent them," Evelyn said. "We believe so, which changes the nature of the charges against Logan Pierce considerably, and which also means that Victor Harlow's exposure in this matter extends well beyond evidence tampering." Evelyn looked at the laptop on the desk. "What do you need from me?" "Original files. The photograph metadata, the timestamp data from the hospital system, the paramedic notes, the originals, not the printed copies. Chain of custody for anything you plan to use in tomorrow's proceedings needs to be clean, and right now the defense has photocopies entered into evidence with verbal attestation. We need the source files, and we need them documented before 9 tomorrow morning." Evelyn reached into her jacket pocket. She removed a small USB drive, the kind that could have been mistaken for a standard thumb drive, except that it wasn't, and she set it on the desk. Aldous looked at it, then at Evelyn. "I've had it with me since I left the hospital this morning," Evelyn said. "Original files, timestamps intact, hash verified. I didn't know who was going to need it or when, but I knew someone was." One of the agents in the corner exhaled audibly. Aldous picked up the drive. She looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone who has been doing a complex job for a long time and occasionally encounters something that makes the job simpler. "You verified the file hashes yourself." "I have a background that makes that kind of thing routine." "Yes." Aldous looked at her. "We're aware of your background, Ms. Harper, which is actually the other reason I wanted to speak with you tonight." She set the drive down on the desk, carefully, and laced her fingers together. "Admiral Drell has been briefed on today's proceedings. He's asked me to convey that the classified file connected to your call sign has been reviewed at the appropriate level, and that if any portion of your service record becomes relevant to tomorrow's proceedings, in the event that opposing counsel attempts to challenge your credibility through your prior service, the relevant commanding officers are prepared to provide documentation." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "That's not going to be necessary." "It may be. Ferris is going to try to discredit me through the classified portion of my record. I know that. But the classified portion of my record is classified for reasons that have nothing to do with discrediting me. And when he hits that wall, and he will hit it, the classification itself will tell the jury everything they need to know. She looked at Aldous. You don't reveal sources to protect sources. The classification protects me better than the documentation would. Aldous studied her for a long moment. You've thought about this. I've had 40 hours to think. She stood up. I need to sleep. I'll be at the courthouse at 8:30. She looked at the drive on the desk. Get what you need from that and have the chain of custody documentation to Rachel Voss before 8. She left the room, walked down the second-floor corridor, and took the stairs instead of the elevator. Because elevators were enclosed, and she'd been enclosed in too many rooms today, and her body was filing a complaint that she was choosing to temporarily ignore. She got to her car. She drove home. She was asleep by 6:15, still in her clothes, the jacket on the hook by the door, the room dark. Hook. She was awake at 5:47 a.m., with the particular alertness of someone whose nervous system has decided that the scheduled duration of sleep was advisory rather than mandatory. She lay still for a moment, running the inventory. Where she was, what day it was, what the next 8 hours required. Then she got up. She showered. She changed into clean clothes, dark slacks, and a gray shirt, and her good boots. She thought about the jacket on the hook, and then she took it. She made coffee, drank half of it, left the rest. She was in the courthouse parking garage at 8:19, and Rachel Voss was waiting for her outside the garage elevator with a tablet in her hand and the look of someone who had also not slept enough but had made peace with it earlier and moved on. NCIS sent the chain of custody documentation at 6:30 this morning, Rachel said without preamble. The original file hashes have been verified. I prepared a motion to submit the complete digital evidence package as a unified exhibit. She fell into step beside Evelyn as they walked toward the entrance. Ferris called me at 7. And? He wanted to know if we'd be open to a discussion about the charges. Evelyn looked at her. What did you tell him? I told him we'd see him in court. Rachel paused, which may have been more satisfying to say than it was strategically optimal, but I stand by it. Courtroom 7 was fuller than it had been the day before. Word had moved through the courthouse, through whatever network of Ashford residents tracked local legal proceedings, through the 2 journalists who'd been in the gallery, and the seats were filled by 8:55 with people who had the energy of an audience that understood it was arriving for the second act of something that had started without them. Evelyn took the witness stand again when Rachel called her. She had been recalled as a witness, which was procedurally standard given the new documentation being submitted, and Whitmore had granted the motion without discussion. The digital evidence package was entered as Exhibit 14. The original photograph, with its intact metadata and verified hash, was now part of the official record in a form that couldn't be contested on chain of custody grounds. The paramedic notes, the security timestamps, the secondary photograph, all of it. Rachel walked her through the authentication of each file. It was methodical work, the kind of testimony that isn't dramatic but is the structural load-bearing wall of everything else. Evelyn answered each question with the same measured precision she'd used the day before. She didn't embellish. She didn't editorialize. She gave the evidence the space to be what it was. Ferris cross-examined her again, and this time he came with a different angle. Not the medical evidence, not the photographs, but her background. Ms. Harper, you stated yesterday that portions of your military service record are classified. That's correct. Can you tell the court the nature of your service? I was a combat medic, multiple deployments over a 9-year period, and the classified portions are classified, yes. Isn't it possible, Ferris said, moving toward the jury box with the posture of someone who has decided this is his move, that the reason those records are classified has less to do with national security and more to do with the fact that your service ended under circumstances that the military prefers not to publicize? The courtroom went very still. Rachel was on her feet. Objection. Counsel is implying facts not in evidence and is making a direct attack on the witness's character without any evidentiary basis. Your Honor, Ferris said, The jury has a right to understand the full context of this witness's credibility. By insinuating that a classified military record indicates misconduct, Whitmore's voice had an edge in it that hadn't been there yesterday. Sustained. Mr. Ferris, I will not allow speculation about the contents of classified records. Rephrase or move on. Ferris moved on, but the question had been asked, which was the point. The asking was the damage, and Ferris knew it, and Evelyn knew it, and the jury had heard it, and that was the reality of cross-examination. She sat with it. She let it sit. Then the gray-suited attorney, Gerald Fitch, stood up from the prosecutorial table and said, Your Honor, may I address the court directly? Whitmore looked at him with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this moment and was not entirely sure it was going to improve his day. You're not counsel of record in this case, Mr. Fitch. I'm aware of that, Your Honor. I'm requesting permission to make a statement as an officer of the court. A long pause. Proceed. Fitch straightened his jacket. He was a man who'd been doing the math since yesterday afternoon, and the math had come up the same way every time he ran it, and he'd spent the previous evening making decisions that people in his position sometimes made when they understood that the alternative was significantly worse. Your Honor, I need to disclose to this court that I was contacted by Victor Harlow prior to my appearance yesterday afternoon and asked to assess the legal exposure arising from these proceedings. In the course of that conversation, Mr. Harlow made statements that I believe are material to the matters currently before this court. He paused. I've prepared a written account of that conversation, which I am prepared to provide to the court and to the NCIS investigators who I understand are working in connection with this case. The gallery sound was immediate and layered. Not the gasp of a movie courtroom, but the overlapping exhale and murmur of 30 people recalibrating at the same moment. Ferris turned and stared at Fitch. His expression was the expression of a man watching a support structure fail. Whitmore held up his hand for quiet. Mr. Fitch, you understand the implications of what you're disclosing. I do, Your Honor. And you're prepared to provide a full account. I am. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. We'll take a recess. He looked at the bailiff. I need the courtroom secured, and I need the NCIS representatives who have been in this building since this morning brought in, please. But the recess lasted 90 minutes. Evelyn spent part of it in the witness anteroom and part of it in the hallway, standing near a window that looked out at the street. She ate a protein bar she'd brought from home and drank water and did not think too hard about the specific shape of what was happening, because thinking too hard about the specific shape of things was a way of getting ahead of them, and getting ahead of things in situations that were still moving was how you made mistakes. Logan's attorney found her at the 40-minute mark. Rachel's composure was intact, but had the quality of something held in place through deliberate effort. Fitch's statement, she said quietly, standing next to Evelyn at the window, includes a direct account of Harlow telling him, and I'm reading from the summary the NCIS agent shared with me, that the 3 men in the parking garage were, quote, supposed to deliver a message, not get into a fight with a trained soldier. Evelyn looked at her. Harlow didn't know Logan was former military. He thought it was going to be a straightforward intimidation. When it went wrong, he panicked, contacted Solano, who he'd used before on a separate matter, and paid him to clean it up. Rachel looked out the window. Kezia Drummond was going to testify against Harlow's company in a wrongful termination proceeding. The assault was intended to intimidate her into withdrawing. And instead Logan walked into the middle of it. And put 3 of Harlow's men in the hospital. Rachel was quiet for a moment. The NCIS agents also found something else in Fitch's statement. Harlow contacted this courthouse. Not Ferris directly. Someone above Ferris. Someone with a connection to the court administration. She stopped. They won't tell me who yet, but the scope of what Harlow did is larger than evidence tampering. Evelyn absorbed that. Whitmore? I don't know. Possibly not. His behavior yesterday didn't read like someone covering something up. It read like someone who didn't know what he was sitting on. She paused. But someone in this building knew. When the court reconvened, Judge Whitmore's face had the specific quality of a man who had spent 90 minutes receiving information that he was still in the process of integrating. He took the bench without preamble and spoke for 3 minutes without sitting, which was not something judges typically did and which made the room very quiet. He confirmed that Gerald Fitch's statement had been received and was being reviewed by NCIS. He confirmed that the statement contained material relevant to the conduct of the investigation preceding this trial. He confirmed that a separate inquiry had been opened into the court administration's handling of certain communications related to the case. Then he looked at Dale Ferris. Mr. Ferris, the prosecution has been working from an evidence package that has now been demonstrated to be incomplete as a result of deliberate action by investigating officers. The defense has submitted a complete digital evidence package that has been authenticated and verified. Given the developments of the past 24 hours, does the prosecution intend to continue presenting its case as currently structured? Ferris stood. He looked like a man who had been given a question he'd hoped to never be asked and had no good answer to. Your Honor, in light of the new information, the prosecution would request an adjournment to review its position. I'm going to deny that request. Whitmore said it without heat. An adjournment serves no purpose other than delay at this point. The evidence before this court has been substantially altered by the disclosure of the NCIS investigation. I'm asking you directly. Does the prosecution have any evidence, independent of the materials provided by Detective Solano's investigation, that supports the charges as filed? The silence was 10 seconds. It felt longer. No, Your Honor, Ferris said. We do not. Whitmore nodded slowly. He looked at the jury, then at Logan Pierce. Mr. Pierce. His voice changed, not softer, more deliberate. You've been at this table for 2 days. I want you to understand what this court is about to do and why. Logan was very still. He had one hand on the table and he was looking at the judge, and whatever he'd spent the last 11 weeks preparing himself for, Evelyn could see from across the room that this particular moment had arrived before he was ready for it. She thought that was probably fine. Some moments should arrive before you're ready. Based on the complete evidentiary record now before this court, and in light of the prosecution's confirmation that it possesses no independent evidence to support the charges as filed, this court is dismissing all charges against Logan Pierce. Whitmore set down the papers he'd been holding. With prejudice, those charges cannot be refiled. The gallery erupted in a way that courtroom galleries are not supposed to erupt, and Whitmore let it go for a moment before he raised his hand for order. Logan Pierce did not move for several seconds. Rachel put her hand on his arm, and he looked at her hand, and then he looked at the judge, and then he nodded once, the kind of nod that means more than the word it replaces. Evelyn looked at the jacket in her lap, and then something happened that she hadn't anticipated. Whitmore looked at her. Ms. Harper, he said, this court has a statement to make. She looked up. Yesterday morning, you arrived in my courtroom after working through the night in a trauma emergency. You appeared as directed, at the time required, under circumstances that would have excused any reasonable person from appearing at all. I treated your appearance as a failure of decorum rather than as evidence of a person who had chosen to honor her commitment to this court and to the defendant in this case at considerable personal cost. He paused. I was wrong to do that. I was wrong in my assessment of you, and I was wrong in the manner in which I addressed you, and I want that acknowledged in the record of these proceedings. The room was very quiet. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. She thought about the right response and found that the right response was simple. Thank you, Your Honor. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then he looked back at the room. We'll recess for 20 minutes and reconvene to address the formal dismissal documentation. The gavel came down. In the corridor afterward, the Admiral found her. He didn't approach with the full ceremony of rank. He came the way people come when they want to speak to a person rather than execute a protocol. His aide stayed back. He stopped about 2 feet away and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. I owe you an explanation, he said. You don't. I recognized the call sign the moment I walked in. He said it plainly, without the self-consciousness that men sometimes brought to these admissions. Djibouti, 2014, the extraction. She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. I've thought about that week more times than I've told anyone, he said. 11 men. The medic who kept 3 of them alive in a collapsed structure for 6 hours before extraction and didn't put her name anywhere in the official record because she'd been operating in a context she wasn't technically cleared for. The paperwork would have created problems, she said. The paperwork would have created problems, he agreed. He looked at the jacket, the call sign, faded but still readable. You kept wearing it. It's warm. The corner of his mouth moved. I'd like to offer you a position. Formal. Medical training, special operations context. The work is important, and the people who do it are rare. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the courthouse windows, she could see the street, the ordinary morning traffic of Ashford, Oregon, a city that was going to be in some newspapers tomorrow and would forget about it by next week. I appreciate that, she said. I'm going to decline. He didn't look surprised. Your patients. My patients still need me, she said it simply. I spent 9 years doing the other work. I'm good at it, but I'm also good at this, and there are enough people in Ashford who come through my trauma bay with nowhere else to go that me leaving would make a difference. They couldn't replace easily. He looked at her for a moment. That's not why most people decline. I know. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and direct, the handshake of someone who'd stopped having anything to prove about handshakes 20 years ago. If you change your mind, he said, I know where to reach you. He nodded. He stepped back. He turned and walked toward the elevator, his aide falling in beside him, and Evelyn watched them go. Then she turned and found Logan Pierce standing 10 feet away, close enough that she understood he'd caught at least part of the exchange. He was looking at her with an expression she didn't have an immediate category for. Not gratitude, they were past that, but something adjacent to it, something that included the specific weight of understanding you'd been carrying a debt for 11 weeks without knowing the full amount of it. You were never just a trauma nurse, he said. I'm exactly a trauma nurse, she said. That's the job I do. He was quiet for a moment. The Admiral, was the mission he mentioned the one that, Logan, she looked at him steadily. You're free. Go home. He looked at her. He nodded. She started toward the elevator. She was halfway there when her phone buzzed. Riverside Memorial. The number she knew the way she knew her own heartbeat. She answered before the second buzz. Harper. Evelyn? It's Martinez. The charge nurse's voice was professional and tight, in the way voices got tight at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday when the reason for calling wasn't administrative. We've got a situation in the ER. Multi-system trauma, 2 patients. One's a 16-year-old with a tension pneumothorax, and the attending on call is Dr. Reeves. Reeves hasn't done a needle decompression without supervision in 3 years, Evelyn said. She was already moving. I'm 12 minutes out. Evelyn, you've been awake for 12 minutes. She pushed through the courthouse door into the gray Oregon morning and moved toward the parking garage at a pace that was not quite running. Tell Reeves don't touch the chest until I get there. Keep the airway open and get 2 large-bore IVs in if they're not already. I'll be there. She was in her car in 4 minutes. She pulled out of the parking garage and into the Ashford morning, the courthouse shrinking in her rearview mirror, and she drove. The jacket was on the seat beside her. The call sign faced up. She drove fast. She drove toward Riverside Memorial and the 16-year-old with the collapsed lung and the attending physician who needed someone who knew what she was doing, and she thought about none of what had happened in the past 2 days, and all of what was about to happen in the next 12 minutes, which was the only way she'd ever known how to do this work. Completely present to the thing in front of her, everything else set down for later. She was 6 blocks from the hospital when her radio, the old one she kept in the car, out of habit from a different life, crackled once. Static. Then a voice, not from the hospital, not from anyone she was expecting, saying 4 words in a clipped and very deliberate tone that made her hands tighten on the wheel. Harper, we found Drummond. Not Martinez, not NCIS, not the Admiral. A voice she recognized from the wrong end of a decade ago, from a context she'd deliberately not revisited, from a part of her life she'd closed and set aside with the same careful compartmentalization she applied to everything that couldn't be undone. She looked at the radio. It was off. The power was off. The voice had come from an off radio, and the Riverside Memorial parking lot was 200 feet ahead, and the 16-year-old's lung was collapsing. And whoever had just spoken through a radio that wasn't transmitting was going to have to wait, because she was already turning into the lot, already reaching for the door handle before the car was fully stopped, already moving. The ER doors opened before she reached them. Martinez had been watching, and Evelyn moved through the receiving bay with the particular shift in gait that happened when her body understood it was no longer in civilian mode. Not running. Efficient. The distinction mattered in trauma work because running communicated panic to everyone around you, and panic was contagious in ways that killed people. "Room 3, Martinez said, falling in beside her. 42 years old, 12 years on the floor, the kind of charge nurse who could manage a full trauma bay with a look. 16-year-old male, Tobias Wren, MVA, passenger side impact, decreased breath sounds on the right, tracheal deviation starting left, SpO2 dropping, 88 and falling. Reeves has a needle drawn, but he's been standing there for 4 minutes. Blood pressure, 78 over 50 and trending down. 4 minutes, Evelyn said. I told him to wait. Good call. Room 3 was controlled chaos in the way that good trauma rooms are. Loud but purposeful, every person with a task, no one standing still. Doctor. Reeves was at the patient's right side with a 14-gauge angiocath in his hand, and the expression on his face was the expression of a physician who knew what needed to be done and was not entirely certain he could do it, which was more self-awareness than some attending showed, and still not enough to make it okay. Tobias Wren was 16 and terrified and working very hard to breathe, which was the wrong kind of work. The labored, paradoxical breathing of a tension pneumothorax, the chest rising wrong, the trachea visibly shifted. His face had the gray undertone that appeared when perfusion started failing at a systemic level. Dr. Reeves, Evelyn said. She didn't take the needle from him. She stood at his shoulder. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. You've done this. The deviation is more pronounced than but it's going to keep being more pronounced until you decompress. You've done this. She kept her voice level. Not loud, not urgent. The voice she used when urgent was the wrong register. I'm right here. Reeves located the landmark, positioned the needle, inserted it. The hiss of air was immediate and audible even over the room noise. The pressurized release of a tension pneumothorax decompressing, one of the most specific sounds in emergency medicine. The sound of a lung remembering it had a job. Tobias Wren's SpO2 began climbing. 88, 91, 93. His color changed in real time. Reeves exhaled. The hand holding the needle was shaking slightly, which Evelyn noted and filed and would address later because later was when there was a later. Right now, the patient's pressure was already responding. 86 over 54, trending up. And she was moving to the head of the bed to assess the airway while the respiratory tech positioned the chest tube tray. Good, she said to Reeves, and she meant it. You did that. He looked at her. He was 34 years old and had been an attending for 18 months and was still in the phase of his career where the gap between knowing and doing was a place you fell into occasionally. You walked in and You did it, she said. I was 2 feet away. The hands were yours. That was important. Not magnanimity. Accuracy. If Reeves didn't own the competence, he'd keep looking for someone else to own it for him, and that was a liability that eventually cost someone a life. She stayed in room 3 for 40 minutes. Chest tube placed, secured, confirmed by portable X-ray showing re-expansion. Tobias Wren's pressure stabilized at 104 over 68, which was not normal but was a number a 16-year-old with his injuries could live from. She spoke to him for about 2 minutes when he was coherent enough to track her voice, told him what had happened, what they'd done, what came next. Because patients who understood what was happening to their bodies had better outcomes than patients who didn't, and she'd believed that since her first deployment, and the evidence had never given her a reason to stop. She came out of room 3 at 11:43 and stood at the nurse's station for a moment, her hands braced on the desk, looking at nothing specific. Martinez appeared beside her with a cup of coffee. Not the vending machine kind. The real pot, the one the charged nurses kept behind the station and didn't advertise. You okay? Martinez asked. Fine. You testified in a federal proceeding yesterday, worked the tail end of a mass casualty event, went somewhere last night that you haven't mentioned, and came in here this morning when you're technically off shift. I'm fine, Elena. You look like you've been awake for 2 days. Closer to 1.5. She picked up the coffee. The boy's going to be okay. Because you walked in. Because Reeves did his job. She drank the coffee. It was better than the vending machine and still not good. I need to make a call. 15 minutes. She took the coffee to the small office at the back of the nursing station, a room the size of a generous closet, used for exactly this kind of purpose, private enough for the calls that needed private. And she closed the door and looked at her phone. The radio in her car. The voice. 4 words. Harper. We found Drummond. She turned the problem over carefully, the way you turn things over when the surface of them could cut you. The radio in her car was a relic. She'd kept it from the transition period after her discharge, the 18 months when she'd been doing work that sat in the unclear territory between her former life and her current one. She'd kept it out of habit, and because old habits in her line of former work were sometimes the only thing between you and a situation you hadn't seen coming. It hadn't been used in 4 years. The battery was probably dead. She hadn't checked it in 18 months. Except she'd heard a voice through it that morning, and the voice had said, "We found Drummond," and Kezia Drummond was the woman from the parking garage whose testimony could end Victor Harlow. And Kezia Drummond had not yet given that testimony, and the NCIS case needed that testimony to close the loop on the conspiracy charge that would take Harlow from a man who'd paid someone else to do something bad to a man who had ordered an assault on a witness in an active legal proceeding. She called NCIS. Deputy Director Aldous answered on the second ring. "Where is Kezia Drummond?" Evelyn asked. A pause. Short, but there. "Ms. Harper, you've been trying to locate her. She hasn't given a full statement yet. Where is she?" Another pause, longer this time. "We believe she's been staying with a relative outside Ashford. She's been reluctant to come forward formally. She's afraid, which is understandable given—" "Someone contacted me this morning." Evelyn kept her voice flat. "Through a channel that shouldn't be active. They said they found her." "Who contacted you?" "I don't know yet, but whoever it was knew my old call routing, which narrows the field considerably." She looked at the wall of the small office, at the bulletin board covered in shift schedules and compliance notices. "I think someone is trying to locate Drummond before she can testify, and I think whoever contacted me this morning is either trying to warn me or they're running an intercept operation, and I happen to be in range." The silence on the other end had a different quality now. "Where are you?" "Riverside Memorial." "Stay there. I'm sending someone." She didn't argue. She ended the call and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she called a number she hadn't called in 4 years, from memory, because she'd never written it down. It rang 6 times. She was counting. On the 7th ring, silence, then a click, then ambient sound. "I was wondering when you'd call," said the voice from the radio. It was a man's voice, older than she remembered. Or maybe she was remembering it wrong. "Took you 40 minutes. I was busy." "I heard. The kid's going to be okay?" "He will be." She kept her voice even. "Who told you where Drummond is?" "Nobody told me. I found her." A pause. "She's scared, Evelyn. She's been scared since before the parking garage. She's been scared since she found the financial records she wasn't supposed to find inside Harlow's company and made the mistake of copying them before she resigned." Evelyn was very still. "She has documents." "She has documents. Physical copies, not digital. She took them the old way, which is the only way that doesn't leave metadata." Another pause. "Harlow's people have been looking for her. Not Solano's people. Different people. The kind of people you don't hire through normal channels." "How long has she been in danger?" "Since 2 days after the parking garage. Since Harlow realized the assault didn't work, and she was still going to testify, and she still had the documents." Evelyn looked at the door of the small office. Through the frosted glass, she could see the blurred shapes of the nursing station, the ordinary movement of hospital work, a world operating on its own logic entirely separate from the one she was currently inhabiting. "Where is she?" Evelyn asked. "Safe. For now." The voice was careful in the way of someone managing information. "I need to know you're connected to the right people before I move her. NCIS is already..." "Not NCIS, not yet. NCIS leaks. Not from the top, Aldous is clean. But somewhere in the chain, information has been moving to places it shouldn't be, and I don't know yet exactly where the pipe is." A pause. "I need the Admiral." Evelyn closed her eyes for 1 second. "You want me to go through Drell?" "Drell has a closed chain. 3 people between him and the director. I know the chain. It doesn't have a leak." The voice was quiet for a moment. "Evelyn, the documents she has..." "If they're what she described when I found her, Harlow has been using that real estate development group to move money through city contracts for 4 years. Not just the evidence tampering, not just the assault. This is structural. This is the kind of thing that takes down a network, not just one person." She opened her eyes. "Where are you?" she said. 80 miles east, small motel. She's calm. More calm than she should be, maybe. But she's been sitting on this for a long time, and I think she's made her peace with what it means to come forward." A pause. "She asked me this morning if the nurse was going to be there." "What nurse?" "The one from the hospital, the one who documented her injuries. She said," and I'm quoting here, "the nurse wrote it all down and nobody paid attention, and now they have to." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. The weight of it was particular, and she didn't try to put it down quickly. "Give me 2 hours," she said. She reached Admiral Drell through the courthouse. He was still in Ashford, still managing whatever the Naval Special Warfare Command needed managing in connection with the investigation. His aide answered the contact number Aldous had given her and put her through in under 3 minutes. She explained the situation in 4 sentences. Drell asked 2 questions. She answered them. "I can have a secure transport team to the location within 90 minutes, he said. "Drummond comes in through our chain, not through the county sheriff's office." "Agreed." "And the documents?" "Physical copies. She needs someone who can establish chain of custody that doesn't touch Solano or anyone connected to his network." "I'll make a call." A pause. "Ms. Harper, the person who contacted you this morning, can you vouch for them?" She thought about the question carefully. "Yes." "That's enough." He ended the call. Evelyn left Riverside Memorial at 1:15 with Martinez watching her go from the nurse's station with the expression of a woman who had learned long ago that there were parts of Evelyn Harper that didn't submit to supervision, and that fighting that fact was a waste of energy. She drove east on Route 9, the same highway where the pileup had happened 2 days ago, the road still carrying the ghost of orange safety cones in her peripheral vision. The Oregon landscape east of Ashford shifted from the wet green of the Coast Range to something drier and more open, the sky bigger. The trees giving way to scrub and then to the long, flat agricultural plain that most people didn't picture when they thought about Oregon. 80 miles. She drove it in 73 minutes, which was not something she'd be documenting anywhere. The motel was called the Sunrise Rest, a 14-unit single-story building that had last been updated sometime in the early 2000s and was currently operating at what appeared to be about 30% capacity. She pulled in and sat in the car for a moment, doing the visual assessment that you did in unfamiliar locations. Entry points, sight lines, which windows had light behind them, where you'd put a person if you didn't want them found. Room 9, she decided. Away from the road, facing the back. She knocked. The door opened immediately, and the man who opened it was someone she hadn't seen in person in 4 years, but recognized from the posture before she fully registered the face. Compact, watchful, with the kind of stillness that came from spending years in places where stillness was protective coloration. His name was Garrett Olave, and he had operated in the same classified context as Evelyn for 3 years before both of them had exited that life by separate routes. He was 41 now. He looked older than that, the way people looked older when the years had been dense. "You made good time," he said. "I wasn't being careful about it." He stepped back to let her in. The room was small and clean enough. 2 chairs, a bed, a table with a laptop Evelyn didn't look at directly. Kezia Drummond was sitting in one of the chairs, and she looked up when Evelyn entered. She was 31 years old, and she looked about 25 and also about 45, which was what sustained fear did to a person. It compressed and expanded the face at the same time. She was thin in a way that suggested the fear had been going on long enough to affect her appetite. Her hands were around a paper cup of something, and she held it the way people held things when they needed to hold something. She looked at Evelyn. She looked at the jacket. "You're the nurse," she said. "Yes." "I didn't know your name. At the hospital." She looked down at the cup. I wasn't doing well that night. I remember the hands. I remember someone holding my wrist very carefully and telling me what they were doing before they did it. I remember thinking that was, I don't know, that nobody had done that in a long time. Evelyn sat in the other chair. "How are you doing right now?" "Better than yesterday. Worse than I'll be in a week, I think." Kezia looked up. "Mr. Olave says I can give my full statement to people who'll actually do something with it." "Yes." "And the documents, well, there'll be a team here within the hour to handle the documents properly." Naval Criminal Investigative Service, through a chain that goes around the compromised part of the local investigation. Evelyn looked at her steadily. "I want to be honest with you about what comes next. Giving a full statement is going to require you to stay in Ashford or be available to return. It's going to mean having your name on documents in an active federal proceeding. The protection you'll receive is real, but it's not frictionless, and I don't want to tell you it is." Kezia nodded slowly. "I've been carrying those documents for 11 weeks. I've been sleeping in 3 different places since August. I lost my job, and I had a cat that I had to give to my sister because I couldn't stay in my apartment, and I've been—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I'm tired of being afraid of him." "Okay," Evelyn said. "That's it? Okay? You've already made the decision. I'm not here to talk you into it or out of it." She leaned forward slightly. "I'm here because you asked if I'd be here, and I said I would." Kezia looked at her for a moment. Then she reached under the mattress of the bed, a move so practiced it was clear she'd done it multiple times, and removed a manila envelope, thick with papers, sealed with a rubber band that had left a groove in the envelope from weeks of pressure. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she held it out to Evelyn. "I made 3 copies," Kezia said. "This is one of them. The others are with 2 different people who've been instructed to deliver them to 2 different federal agencies if I don't check in every 48 hours. She paused. "I'm not stupid." "No," Evelyn said, taking the envelope. "You're not." "What?" The NCIS transport team arrived at 2:48. A 3-person unit, 2 agents, and a document specialist who handled Kezia's copies with the careful procedure of people who understood that chain of custody was the difference between a conviction and a mistrial. Garrett Olave gave a separate statement, brief and precise, covering how he'd located Drummond and what she'd told him. Evelyn sat outside the room on a plastic chair under the motel's overhang while the process happened inside, with the afternoon sun hitting the parking lot at an angle that made the cracked asphalt look almost warm. She thought about Victor Harlow. She'd looked him up in the weeks between Logan's arraignment and today. Self-made, mostly. The kind of businessman who appeared in local publications as a philanthropist and in county records as someone who'd won a specific category of development contracts with remarkable consistency over the past decade. He had a son, 26, who was not in the real estate business and whose name appeared in the financial records Kezia had copied. He had a wife who appeared at charitable events. He had the kind of public profile that was built to be the thing people saw when they looked at him. She thought about Kezia Drummond finding the financial records inside a company she'd trusted enough to work for. Finding them and copying them, which meant she'd known immediately that they were dangerous, which meant she'd understood the risk and done it anyway. Quiet courage was rarely the dramatic kind. Usually it looked like someone making a decision in an ordinary office, alone, with a photocopier, and then living for 11 weeks with what that decision cost them. Her phone rang. Rachel Voss. "Judge Whitmore has issued 3 formal orders in the last hour," Rachel said without preamble. She sounded wired in the specific way of attorneys who were managing an expanding situation and running on professional adrenaline. First, Detective Solano has been placed on administrative suspension pending a formal IA investigation. Second, the original investigation file has been sealed and transferred to NCIS custody. Third, and this is the one, Whitmore has referred Victor Harlow's name to the Ashford County DA and to the federal prosecutor's office for investigation into potential criminal conspiracy charges related to the evidence tampering and the assault on Kezia Drummond. Evelyn looked at the parking lot. He moved fast. He's moving like a man who's very aware that he spent 2 days presiding over a case built on corrupted evidence, and he wants it on the record that the moment he knew, he acted. A pause. Which, honestly, fair. What about the court administration question? The communication Harlow allegedly had with someone in the building? That one is more complicated. Rachel's voice changed slightly. Whitmore has referred it internally, but he hasn't named a specific individual yet. There's going to be a separate inquiry, probably at the state level. It may take a while. A pause. But it's referred. It's on record. It doesn't disappear. Harlow knows his exposure by now. His personal attorney, not Fitch, his other attorney, filed a motion 2 hours ago to have all communications between Harlow's company and the court sealed, which tells you everything you need to know about whether Harlow understands his exposure. She paused. Whitmore denied the motion. Evelyn exhaled, not quite a laugh. Of course he did. The denial was, Evelyn, he wrote 3 paragraphs in the denial, in a procedural motion denial. He basically said that the purpose of the court system is the pursuit of truth and the protection of individuals from exactly the kind of manipulation this case represents, and that sealing communications to protect a potential defendant from the consequences of his own actions would be a fundamental betrayal of that purpose. Those weren't his exact words. Close enough. The court reporter is going to have opinions about the overtime. A pause. Harlow's going to be arrested. Maybe not today, but the referral is in, the evidence is in, and Drummond's documents, assuming they are what they're reported to be, they are. A brief silence. You've seen them. I have them. Evelyn. Rachel's voice went very careful. What's in them? 4 years of payment records. City contracts that went to Harlow's development group through a selection process that appears to have involved payments to 2 members of the Ashford City Council. The payments are routed through the same shell company structure that was used to pay Solano. She looked at the envelope in her lap. It's not just the assault on Drummond. Harlow's been running this for years. The assault was him trying to protect something that was already criminal. Silence on the line. The kind of silence that happens when an attorney is recalculating the scope of a case in real time. 2 city council members, Rachel said slowly. That's what the documents indicate. Their names are in those records. Initials and payment account numbers. It'll take forensic accounting to connect them definitively, but the documents give investigators somewhere to start that they wouldn't have had otherwise. Rachel was quiet for a moment. The DA's office is going to need those today. The NCIS documents team is with me now. Evelyn looked back at room 9. It's being handled. Wah. She drove back to Ashford in the late afternoon, the sun moving behind the coast range, the highway emptying as she came back into the city's edge. She was tired in a way that had passed through ordinary exhaustion and come out the other side into something more functional, the flatlined alertness of a person running on system reserves. She went to the hospital first, not because she had to. She was off shift and Martinez would have her head if she tried to pick up the floor, but because there was a follow-up she needed to do. Tobias Wren had been moved to the ICU, which was correct and expected. She looked at his chart from the nursing station, not because anything in it would surprise her, but because completing the loop was part of how she worked. He was stable. His lung had stayed expanded on the repeat X-ray. His pressure was 112/74. His mother was in the family waiting room on the 3rd floor. Evelyn went up. Mrs. Wren was 40-something, dark circles under her eyes, wearing the specific clothing of someone who'd left the house in a hurry and hadn't been home since. She looked up when Evelyn came in, and something in her face asked the question before she could say it. He's stable, Evelyn said. The lung is holding. His pressure is good. He's going to need monitoring and probably another chest x-ray in the morning, but the doctors are comfortable with where he is. Mrs. Wren put her face in her hands. She didn't cry loudly. She made the contained sound of someone who has been holding something at bay for several hours and has just been told they're allowed to put it down. Evelyn sat with her for a few minutes. She didn't say much. There wasn't much that needed saying. She was in the elevator going back down when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she recognized as one of the NCIS agents from the motel. Documents authenticated and in custody. Drummond en route to secure location. DA contacted. Expect movement on Harlow within 48 hours. She read it twice. Put the phone in her pocket. She walked out of Riverside Memorial into the Ashford evening, the air cold and slightly damp the way Oregon evenings got, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. And then her phone rang again, and the number on the screen was Logan Pierce's, and she answered it. "Hey," he said. He sounded different than he had in the courtroom, looser, like something that had been braced had been allowed to release. "I'm not going to keep calling you. I wanted to tell you that I looked up Kezia Drummond's case, the wrongful termination. I didn't know that's what this was about." Most people didn't. She came forward. It wasn't a question. "She did." A pause. "Is she okay?" Evelyn looked at the street. "She will be." "Good." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what you said, in the elevator, about being exactly a trauma nurse. Logan, I'm not going to push it. I wanted you to know that I think what you are is something that doesn't have a word for it, and I think you probably already know that." Another pause. "I'll let you go." He ended the call. She stood on the sidewalk for another moment. The city moved around her, traffic, a couple walking a dog, the distant sound of something that might have been a siren or might have been a car alarm. She put her phone in her pocket and was turning toward the parking lot when she felt it. Wrong. Not a sound, not a sight. The specific gathering of environmental information that happens below the conscious processing level when your nervous system has been trained to detect threat signatures, a shift in the quality of the space behind her, a shadow in the wrong place, the particular weight of someone trying not to be heard. She didn't turn. She walked. She walked toward her car at the same pace she'd been walking, because turning would tell whoever was behind her that she'd made them, and she hadn't decided yet whether that was information she wanted them to have. Third row of the parking lot. Her car was second from the end. She reached into her jacket pocket, not for her phone, for her keys, which she held the way she'd been taught to hold them 15 years ago in a different life. She reached the car. She put her hand on the door handle. And then the man who'd been following her said, from 8 feet back, in the careful tone of someone who understood he only had one chance to say what he needed to say before she made a decision that would end the conversation. "Ms. Harper, my name is Owen Delacroix. I work for Victor Harlow, but I'm not here because he sent me." A pause. "I'm here because I know something that isn't in the documents and isn't in the evidence log and isn't going to come out unless someone tells it, and I've been trying to decide for 6 days whether I'm the person who's going to tell it." Evelyn turned around. He was 30-something, slight, with the look of someone who spent more time at a computer than anywhere else and was standing in a parking lot trying to be brave about something that was costing him considerably. He had no visible weapon. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and his shoulders up around his ears, and the expression of a man who was more afraid of what he was about to say than of what she might do to him, which told her a fair amount. "What don't I know?" she said. He exhaled. "The 2 council members in the payment records, Drummond's documents show the accounts, but they don't show the third one." He looked at her. "There's a third payment line. It goes to a different account. I've seen it. I've seen the source documents. Not the copies Drummond took, the originals, on Harlow's private server, the one that isn't connected to the company network." He paused. "The third account belongs to a sitting judge." The parking lot was very quiet. "Which judge?" Evelyn said. He looked at her for a long moment, the way someone looks when they understand that the word they're about to say is going to change the shape of something irrevocably, and they're making their final peace with that fact. "Whitmore," he said. Evelyn looked at Owen Delacroix for a long moment without speaking. The parking lot held its silence around them. The ordinary sounds of a hospital complex at evening, distant and separate, belonging to a different layer of reality than the one she was currently standing in. "How certain are you?" she said. "I've seen the transfer records 3 times. The account number is consistent across 4 separate transactions over 14 months. He wasn't fidgeting. That was notable. A man delivering this kind of information who wasn't fidgeting had either rehearsed it many times or had arrived at a very specific kind of calm on the other side of a very specific kind of fear. Harlow keeps a shadow ledger on a private server he thinks is air-gapped. It's not fully air-gapped. There's a maintenance backdoor that the original IT contractor left in and never closed." He paused. "I know because I'm the one who installed the server." "You work in IT." "I worked in IT. 6 years with Harlow's company. I maintained the infrastructure, which means I had access to things I was never supposed to understand the significance of, and for most of those 6 years I didn't." He looked at his hands. "About 8 months ago I started understanding." "And you waited 8 months." He looked up at her. "I have a daughter. She's 4. He said it simply, without asking her to forgive him for it. "I've been trying to find a way to do this that doesn't... I needed to be sure there was a chain that could protect this information without it coming back to me before the people who needed to be arrested actually got arrested." Evelyn looked at him. The Whitmore piece sat in the center of her thinking, and she turned it carefully, examining its implications. Whitmore, who had opened the day dismissing her. Whitmore, who had reversed himself completely when the Admiral appeared. Whitmore, who had spent 2 days issuing orders against Harlow's interests with the energy of a man performing his own defense, the public record of a judge acting correctly, built in real time on top of a private record that said something entirely different. Or, the other possibility, which she owed him enough to consider, a man who had received payments he'd rationalized into something he could live with, and who had then found himself presiding over a case that revealed the full dimensions of what he'd been rationalizing and had made a different choice when it was almost too late. Neither possibility changed what needed to happen next, but it changed the shape of what she thought about him, which mattered to her even if it didn't matter to anyone else. "Is the server still accessible?" she said. "I pulled a full encrypted copy of the shadow ledger 3 days ago. It's stored off-site. I have the decryption key." He reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. He held it out to her. "This is a hash of the ledger file and the location of the physical drive. I haven't given it to anyone else." She took the paper. She looked at it. A string of characters. A storage facility address on the east side of Ashford. "Why me?" she said. "Why not NCIS directly?" "I went to the courthouse yesterday afternoon," he said. "I watched what happened in that building. I watched how you testified." He paused, and the pause had the quality of someone who had made a long calculation and was stating the result. "I needed to give this to someone who I was confident wasn't in a network I didn't understand. Someone who'd walked into a room where she had every reason not to trust the system and had trusted the evidence instead." He looked at her steadily. "I figured if the system was going to corrupt you, it already would have." Evelyn folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket, in the same place she'd carried the USB drive for 2 days. She looked at Owen Delacroix, his slight frame, his hands that had gone back into his jacket pockets, his 4-year-old daughter, who was the reason he'd waited 8 months, and also the reason he was standing in a hospital parking lot at dusk, handing classified financial records to a trauma nurse. "Go home to your daughter," she said. "Don't go to your office. Don't contact anyone at Harlow's company. By tomorrow morning, someone from NCIS will call you on whatever number you give me now, and they'll want a formal statement and you'll give it." He gave her a number. She saved it. "Ms. Harper," he said as she turned toward her car, "is Whitmore actually... do you think he..." "That's not my determination to make," she said. "It's the evidences." She got in the car and called Aldous before she'd started the engine. The next 72 hours moved in the way that the legal and federal machinery moves when it finally gets its hands on something solid. Not fast by the standards of television, not clean by the standards of anyone who'd like a simple story, but with the inevitable, grinding momentum of a process that couldn't be stopped once it had started. Evelyn spent 3 hours on Wednesday evening with 2 NCIS forensic accountants and a federal prosecutor named Darius Kwan, who asked questions with the methodical intensity of someone assembling a structure from the ground up and checking every joint. She gave them the paper. She gave them Delacroix's number. She told them what Delacroix had told her and answered their follow-up questions as precisely as she could, and corrected herself twice when she realized she was paraphrasing rather than recalling, because the distinction mattered and she was precise about the things that mattered. She got home at 11. She slept for 9 hours. It was the longest she'd slept in a week, and she woke up with the particular heaviness of a body that had been given what it needed and was filing a delayed invoice for everything it had been owed. On Thursday morning, Victor Harlow was arrested at his home in the Ashford Hills neighborhood at 7:15 a.m. by federal agents operating under a warrant that had been issued at midnight. The warrant covered conspiracy to commit assault, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and bribery of a public official, the last charge applicable 3 times over, covering Solano and the 2 city council members whose initials appeared in Drummond's documents, and one more name that wasn't on the warrant yet, but whose time was coming. Evelyn learned about the arrest from Martinez, who texted her a news alert at 7:52 with 3 words. It happened. Finally, she was in the hospital. She'd come in at 7 for a regular shift, the kind of shift she'd had 100 times before, would have 100 more, where the work was not dramatic and was also the most important work she knew how to do. She was reviewing overnight charts at the nursing station when the text came in. She read it, put her phone face down on the desk, and went back to the charts. The morning moved. 2 admissions, 1 discharge, a consult with a vascular surgeon about a patient in Bay 4 whose presentation had a detail that didn't fit the obvious diagnosis, and turned out, on further review, not to fit it. Evelyn was right about the detail. She usually was, which was not a source of pride so much as the result of paying sustained attention for 14 years. At 10:30, Rachel Voss called. "Whitmore resigned this morning," Rachel said, "effective immediately. He submitted a written statement to the State Judicial Commission." A pause. "Evelyn, the statement, he acknowledged receiving 3 payments from a shell company connected to Harlow's network over an 18-month period. He said he'd told himself at the time that they were legitimate consulting fees for a period before he'd joined the bench. He said he'd known that wasn't true and had not allowed himself to examine that knowledge." Another pause. "He said presiding over the Pierce case was the experience of watching himself in a mirror he'd been avoiding." Evelyn sat with that. "Is he being charged?" "The federal prosecutor is reviewing the statement and the ledger. Kwan told me the payments are smaller than the others. The amounts don't suggest he was a primary beneficiary, more of a... He's describing it as insurance. Harlow's way of having a friendly face on the bench if something ever landed there." Rachel's voice was careful. "Whether he gets charged or not, his career is over. He knows it. He said so in the statement." "He wrote it himself?" "No attorney. Handwritten. Filed it before 6 this morning." A pause. "He included a paragraph about you." Evelyn looked at the wall of the nursing station. "Rachel, he wrote that he had allowed assumptions about a witness's appearance to override his judicial function, and that those assumptions had compounded an injustice that had already been constructed by others, and that he was responsible for his portion of it, regardless of what others had done." Rachel paused. "He said the witness had demonstrated more integrity in 36 hours without sleep than he had demonstrated in 30 years on the bench." The nursing station was quiet around her. Someone was doing something at the medication cart down the hall. The monitor in Bay 2 was making its regular sound. "That's not something he had to put in there," Evelyn said. "No," Rachel said. "It's not." Our trusts. Detective Kendrick Solano was arrested on Thursday afternoon. Charges filed by the county DA in coordination with the federal prosecutor's office. Evidence tampering, bribery, and obstruction of justice. He had a lawyer by the time he was walked out of the Ashford Police Department's Internal Affairs office, which meant he'd had the lawyer on standby, which meant he'd known this was coming and had been preparing for it, which was its own kind of admission. The 2 city council members, whose names the forensic accountants had connected to the payment accounts within 48 hours, using the records from Delacroix's shadow ledger, were both placed on administrative leave by Thursday evening and under formal investigation by Friday morning. One of them released a statement through his attorney denying any knowledge of the payment's source. The other one didn't release a statement, which told a cleaner story. Owen Delacroix gave his formal statement to NCIS on Thursday afternoon. Afterward, Aldous arranged for him to be connected with the federal prosecutor's Witness Coordination Office, which handled the specific kind of protection that came with being a cooperating witness in a federal case. He texted Evelyn that evening. A single line, no preamble. My daughter asked me why I was home early. I didn't have a good answer. Working on it. She texted back. That's the right problem to have. Kezia Drummond gave her full formal statement on Friday morning. She sat across from two federal investigators in a conference room at the NCIS field office that Aldous had set up in Ashford for the duration of the investigation, and she talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes, covering the financial records she'd found, the circumstances of her resignation, the intimidation she'd experienced in the weeks that followed, and what had happened in the parking garage. Evelyn wasn't in the room for the statement. She was at the hospital. But Rachel called her afterward and described it in the way attorneys describe things, when the description was also a kind of processing. In short, complete sentences, each one carrying its own weight. She talked about the hospital, Rachel said, about the nurse who documented the injuries without being asked to, who held her wrist carefully and told her what was happening before doing anything. She said she'd thought about that night a lot in the past 11 weeks. She said it was the first time in the whole situation that she'd felt like someone was paying attention to her as a person and not as a problem to be managed. Evelyn looked at the ceiling of the break room where she was eating her lunch, a sandwich she'd made at home, which was an improvement over the vending machine. She's going to be okay, she said. She is. A pause. Are you? I'm eating a sandwich. That's not an answer. It's evidence. Rachel made a sound that was almost a laugh. There's going to be a formal hearing next week. The DA wants you present. It's not testimony. It's a public record proceeding, acknowledging the role your documentation played in the investigation. You don't have to speak. I'll be there. Evelyn. Rachel's voice changed. I've been doing this for 9 years. I've handled 23 felony trials. I've never had a case turn on a photograph that a nurse took at 2 a.m. because that's just what she did. A pause. I want you to know that I understand what that is, what that took. Evelyn finished the sandwich. Tell Logan I said congratulations. Tell him yourself. He keeps asking if I've spoken to you. He can call me. He said he doesn't want to keep calling you. Then he can call me once, she said. That's fine. Logan Pierce called her on Friday evening, and the call lasted 12 minutes, which was longer than either of them typically talked on phones, but shorter than the conversation probably warranted. He told her he'd started the paperwork to get back his contractor's license, which had been in limbo since the charges were filed. He told her he'd spoken to Kezia Drummond on Thursday. Not a long conversation, just a brief one. Two people acknowledging to each other the specific thing they'd been through together without requiring the other one to name it precisely. He told her he'd slept 8 hours straight for the first time in 11 weeks. What are you going to do now? She asked. Work, he said. The same thing I was doing. I'm good at it. A pause. What about you? Same thing I'm doing. The ER. The ER. He was quiet for a moment. You don't want more than that? You could... Logan? She was at home, standing at her kitchen window, looking at the backyard that she'd been meaning to do something with for 2 years and hadn't. I want exactly this. That's the thing about a purpose. When you have one that fits, wanting something else is like wanting a different bone structure. You can consider it, but you can't really mean it. He thought about that. Yeah, he said. Okay. Go get your license back. Going. A pause. Hey, thank you, for real. Get some sleep, she said. The formal public proceeding happened on Tuesday of the following week, in the same courtroom 7 where all of it had started, now with a different judge presiding, the Honorable Sandra Mwangi, brought in from the district court on a temporary assignment, while the State Judicial Commission conducted its review of all cases that had passed through Whitmore's courtroom in the previous 18 months. The proceeding was administrative in form, but had the quality of something more. The gallery was full, fuller than the trial had been, which said something about what the trial had become in the 10 days since it ended. There were journalists. There were people Evelyn didn't recognize who had apparently decided this was something they needed to witness. Judge Mwangi was 63, direct, and had the specific no-nonsense precision of someone who had been cleaning up other people's procedural messes for decades, and had made her peace with the fact that this would continue to be part of her professional life. She moved through the administrative elements of the proceeding efficiently. The formal entry of the dismissal with prejudice in Logan Pierce's case, the formal notation of the NCIS referrals, the formal acknowledgement of the documentation that had precipitated the investigation. Then she looked up from the papers in front of her and said something that was not in the prepared record. "I want to take a moment," she said, "to acknowledge something that doesn't appear in the legal documentation because the legal documentation isn't designed to capture it." She looked at Evelyn, who was seated in the gallery, not called to testify, not required to be anywhere specific, just present because Rachel had asked her to be, and because she'd decided that showing up to the things that required her presence was, at this point in the story, the right call. "Ms. Harper, you were subpoenaed to testify in a proceeding where the evidence had been deliberately manipulated to ensure a particular outcome. You came from a 36-hour shift. You were treated with contempt when you arrived. And the documentation that broke this case open was documentation you generated 14 months earlier during a 2 a.m. trauma admission, because documentation is what you do." The courtroom was very quiet. "You didn't do any of that because you were asked to," Mwangi continued. "You did it because doing your job completely was, apparently, non-negotiable for you. I think that's worth saying out loud, in a room with a record attached to it." Evelyn sat in the gallery and didn't do anything with her face because there wasn't a right thing to do with her face in this moment. The jacket was on her shoulders. She'd stopped having a reason to take it off, or stopped caring about whether she had a reason. The call sign faced out toward the room. From the second row of the gallery, Admiral Marcus Drell, who had no procedural reason to be present, and was present anyway, did not look at her. He looked at the front of the courtroom with the expression of a man attending a ceremony for someone who deserved one. Mwangi moved on. The proceeding concluded in 22 minutes. Outside in the corridor, the usual dispersal. Rachel moving toward her with that post-proceeding energy, controlled and professional with something warmer underneath it. Logan on the other side of the gallery door, talking to his attorney about license paperwork in the practical tone of a man who has returned to the business of his life. Kezia Drummond, who had come, which Evelyn hadn't expected, standing near the window at the end of the hall, looking out at the street with the expression of someone learning to occupy space again after a long time of making herself small. Evelyn walked toward her. Kezia heard her coming and turned, and whatever she'd been preparing to say, she didn't say. She just looked at Evelyn, and Evelyn looked back, and the thing between them didn't require language particularly. "How are you doing?" Evelyn asked. "I wake up at 3 in the morning," Kezia said. "I think I'm going to do that for a while." "Probably." "Does it stop?" Evelyn thought about the honest answer, which wasn't the simple one. "It changes. The 3 a.m. thing changes into something you can work with. It stops feeling like ambush and starts feeling like, I don't know, information." She paused. "It takes a while." Kezia nodded slowly. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't copied those documents. If I'd just quit and walked away and told myself it wasn't my problem." She looked down at her hands. "I almost didn't copy them. I had the originals in front of me and I almost just put them back." "But you didn't." "I didn't." She looked up. "That's the thing I keep coming back to. That one moment, I almost made a different choice." Evelyn thought about her own version of that moment. 2 a.m. 14 months ago, a trauma bay. A patient who was frightened and injured and already becoming a problem that someone in authority wanted to manage rather than investigate. The photograph she'd taken because she always took photographs during significant trauma admissions, because documentation was her protocol, because she'd learned in a field hospital in Iraq that the things you didn't write down disappeared as if they'd never happened. And the things that disappeared as if they'd never happened had a way of happening again to someone else. She hadn't known, taking that photograph, that it would matter the way it mattered. She'd known only that it was true, and that true things were worth recording. "You made the choice you made," Evelyn said. "That's what happened. The rest of it is what that choice made possible." Kezia looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, for writing it down." "That's the job," Evelyn said. It was the truest thing she knew how to say, and it was also the most complete thing, which was why she said it without adding anything to it. Some sentences were finished when they were finished. What? She found a quiet moment near the elevator while the corridor sorted itself out. Drell appeared beside her without announcement, the way he'd appeared in the courtroom 9 days ago, with the same quality of presence, large without being loud, authoritative without requiring performance. "The offer stands," he said, "indefinitely." "I know." She looked at him. "I appreciate that." But no. He nodded. He looked down the corridor at the room where the proceeding had been, at the people moving through the aftermath of something that had required a great deal of many people and was now, in the specific sense that legal matters are resolved. "The extraction in Djibouti," he said. "The reason your name wasn't in the record. The paperwork would have—" "You've said that." He looked at her. "I've read what actually happened, not the record. The account from the team lead which he filed internally and which isn't in any system that gets reviewed by anyone outside a very specific office." He paused. "You were there on a transit clearance. You weren't supposed to be in that zone at all. You stayed 6 hours in a collapsed structure with 3 critically injured men because leaving them wasn't something you were able to do, and you made a calculation that your own court-martial was an acceptable cost if it meant they came home." She said nothing. "They didn't court-martial you," he said. "No. Because the team lead filed the internal account instead of the official report, which meant there was no official record of you being there. He made a judgment call. He protected you. He protected the mission integrity," she said. "I happen to benefit from that." Drell looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has heard a particular kind of deflection many times and knows exactly what it is. "You stayed," he said simply. "That's the part that matters. You could have left, and you stayed." She looked at the elevator button. "People were hurt. People are always hurt. Most people leave anyway." He paused. "I've known a lot of people in my career, Ms. Harper. The ones who stay, they don't tend to explain themselves. They just stay." He extended his hand. "Take care of your patients." She shook it. "Take care of your people." He walked toward the stairwell. His aide materialized from somewhere down the corridor and fell in beside him, and they went through the door, and she watched it close, and then she pressed the elevator button. She was back in the emergency department by 2:15 in the afternoon, which was not required of her and which she had also not discussed with anyone as a plan. She changed at her locker, clean scrubs, her regular jacket over them. The military one hung on the hook inside the door, where she could see it. Martinez looked at her from the nursing station. "You're not on shift," Martinez said. "I know." "You just came from a courthouse proceeding." "I know." "Evelyn." "Elena." She looked at her. "Is there something that needs doing, or isn't there?" Martinez held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the board. "Bay 6 has been waiting 40 minutes for a wound assessment. The attending is backed up with a code in 3. "Bay 6, Evelyn said. She walked. The patient in Bay 6 was a man in his early 50s named Paul, who'd done something to his forearm with a table saw that was less catastrophic than it could have been and more serious than he was admitting to himself. He looked up when Evelyn came in with the expression that patients had when they'd been waiting long enough to start wondering if anyone was coming. "Hi," she said. "I'm Evelyn. I'm going to take a look at what you've got." She pulled on gloves and moved to the bed. The wound was a clean laceration, 4 centimeters, deep enough that the underlying tissue needed evaluation, shallow enough that what he needed was careful cleaning and proper closure and someone paying attention to the edges. "This is going to need a few sutures," she told him. "Nothing complicated, but we want to do it right." He looked at the arm. "I should have been more careful." "Probably," she said without judgment. "We'll get it sorted. She worked methodically and carefully. She talked him through what she was doing before she did it, because that was her protocol. And because it was also the right way to treat a person who was in a strange place, having something done to a part of their body without understanding it. He relaxed, incrementally, in the way patients relaxed when they understood that the person handling them was paying attention. When she was done, she documented it, every detail. The condition of the wound on arrival, the cleaning protocol, the closure, the aftercare instructions. Written down, time-stamped, part of the record. She did it because she always did it. Because the things you didn't write down disappeared as if they'd never happened. Because she had learned, in field hospitals and trauma bays and a collapsed building in Djibouti and a courtroom in Ashford, Oregon, that the most important thing a person could do with the skills they carried was to use them completely. Not heroically, not for recognition, not in moments designed to be witnessed, but consistently, in the ordinary hours, in the dark shifts, in the rooms where no one important was watching. She had spent years being the person in the room that other people looked past. She had learned that this was, in its own strange way, a form of power. The power of the unobserved, the competence of the person no one has decided to account for. The documentation filed at 2 a.m. that waits in a manila folder for 14 months until the day arrives when it changes everything. She hadn't asked to be seen. She'd asked to do her job completely, and the job had eventually made the scene unavoidable. That was how she understood what had happened, not as a vindication, not as a triumph. Those were words that fit stories that ended more cleanly than real ones did. As a consequence, as the natural result of 14 years of paying attention in rooms where the people who mattered most were the ones least likely to have anyone advocating for them when the machinery of power decided they were inconvenient. She threw away her gloves and washed her hands and walked back to the nursing station, and the emergency department moved around her with its ordinary urgency, monitors and voices, and the particular fluorescent light of a place that never closed. And she took the next chart from Martinez without being asked. The jacket was on the hook in her locker, the call sign facing in. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do, and no one in the building needed to know what it had taken to get her here, or what she'd done before she'd learned that this was the work that fit her best. They just needed her to show up. She always showed up.